Who is like the wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his countenance is changed. Eric was like the wise man, and he knew the interpretation of a thing. Something of a prophet, a unique person, he searched for a better world, and he will be missed.
The purpose of a local newspaper should be to reflect all the things that go on in the community.
Eric, I've got quite a good story. There's this travel agent, he's Italian, Camden High Street.
Yeah.
It's a mercy dash. You know, he's...
Mercy dash, what do you mean?
Well, apparently he grew up in one of the villages which has been hit by the earthquake, and he heard about his elderly parents living there. He knows they're there, so he's...
This is in Italy, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he rushed there, and I gather the main quake was on Sunday, and he got there, you know, through hell and high water. It's really difficult. He got there on Tuesday, and he found them sitting around a campfire, you know, sort of huddled together, and dead bodies, and he said the old church clock had gone and the school had gone.
So it's a very good story, actually. Make page one, I should imagine.
He wasn't only interested in left-wing working-class readers of Camden, he was interested in working-class readers of Camden, because they were his people. Because actually, strangely enough, he said that he never met a middle-class person until he was in the army. So he was completely, his whole life was surrounded by working-class people of, you know, of Manchester area and the other towns that he was living in. And he had this feeling about needing to write about it, or wanting to write about it, and so initially he wanted to be a novelist.
He would find the sort of little guy, he was really good at doing that, and champion that person until, you know, people in high places were admitting, as a matter of fact, yes, this person's right and we've done this wrong.
He would challenge whatever authority it was, whether it was a socialist authority or conservative.
The man, I mean, he believed in socialism. He believed in justice for the masses, for those who have no voice.
The motto was, open to all, coerced by none.
When the paper's delivered on Thursdays into the dispensing bins, you see people, you know, rushing to get it. You know, that's where they're going, to pick up the journal. So it's a very important part of borough life.
Eric used to come here for his beard trim, but he never let me cut his hair because he used to cut his own hair. Every week when I'm coming from the car, I always pick one Thursday morning.
What's your favorite bit?
Well, my favorite bit is all the back sports. And local news, of course.
Well, definitely an idealist, yeah. But a hard-bitten idealist when it came to business.
The initial aim was to break even, and beyond that to operate on low profit margins, and that will explain why the journals survived for so long.
Eric was always determined not to borrow any money, so we haven't borrowed any money, so we've never been hooked to the banks, except for a small overdraft every now and again. So we could always survive through that, and we had to just cut back on expenditure when times got really hard.
Local newspapers in themselves are very important, and unfortunately hundreds of titles are being closed down. They have been closed down over the last 40 years, and those that survive are taken over by huge companies, some of them from the US. In fact, most of the newspapers are not based in the community. They're warehoused in places like Romford. So the Ham and High is based in Romford now. So very far away from the community it's supposed to serve. Whereas the Camden Journal is in the heart of the community, knows what's going on. Many of its reporters live in the community. So this all makes a difference.
Camden New Journal brings all these things to a head, lets people know what's going on, and we can connect with people this way. So it's a real resource. They promote this community spirit.
We are deeply honoured to unveil this memorial today as a permanent statement of our sorrow and yet our pride for the prisoners of war, over 66,000 who suffered and died in POW camps in the Far East. And thanks to the Camden New Journal, a sum of money was raised from Camden residents to help with the works we then undertook to set up such a memorial.
One of the captives in the camps was that wonderful artist Ronald Searle, and he secretively did drawings. He recorded what was happening, and his drawings have been published, and we are using one of them, drawn in captivity, on the memorial.
Camden wouldn't be Camden without the Camden New Journal, to be honest. And the old journal, I even remember the old journal because when I was 10, I got my sort of 10-yard swimming certificate and I was in the journal then. And when it came back as the Camden New Journal, I just set my sights on wanting to be on that paper because by the point of my journalism qualification, it had such a strong reputation.
He used to sit in here. He used to come in often here. He used to like ciabatta and with the cheese, with the salami, avocado. He loves avocado, I know. And sometimes he used to have a vegetarian samosa with a salad or poached egg he likes. He was very organized, innit? Yeah, he used to love his job. He used to do everything perfectly. Yeah, you can't tell when you see the person, his mind in the focusing things.
He'd ring you up in all hours of the day and night about all kinds of things, sometimes petty, sometimes highly serious things about the meaning of life and stuff like that. And you have to sit there. I'd be sitting there wanting to go to sleep because I'm starting working in a few hours. And that was a nuisance at one stage, but as the years went on, we began to appreciate it. It was good to have him ringing up.
We took him picketing, and then he came back, met all the family and all the friends, all the pickets, and that was it. He just became a member of the family.
During the heat of the strike, he gave me a bit of a dose of reality, because obviously when you're young and naive, you think, we've got to win, we must win, and he had a little chat with me. He says, do you realise what you're against here?
I was thinking recently about Eric and his gift for just listening to people and drawing things out of them. I mean, he wasn't just fishing for a story. He was also interested in who you were and what's your background and what's your story.
It was knowing that from all those years that Eric was there. Eric was an anchor that was there, and I could phone him. And if I didn't phone him, then we knew where we were,
And I got to thinking, where did he get that gift from? And I think it may have been from his training in earlier years when he was training to be a rabbi. Maybe that's where it came from.
For much of his adult life, he did not practice a religion, but he was intensely respectful of the faith and religious sensibilities of others. This was very evident in the journal's even-handedness of honouring faith communities in the borough, in their service to the wider community.
But we always ended up on what's the afterlife going to be like. And but I think we agreed at the finish that there was a spirit there. And I think we also agreed that when it got near time, we'd have to go religious, And I'd have to give me confession as a Catholic, and I don't know exactly what you do with the Jewish religion, but I know Eric will go in that way, definitely.
It's funny, I had to take out his tefillin and his tallis the other day, which is all, he used to keep it in a little bag that's down there with the Star of David on, and of course it was completely moth-eaten. It's a sort of a moth's nest. I put it outside, hoping the moths would dissipate. It's maybe a week before he died, he said to me he would like to put a mezuzah outside the front door, which is a little scroll that you bless as you come in the house. He said, I don't want to hide my Jewishness anymore.
He was very anti-religion when I first met him, and so I think he changed his tune. He had several scrapes with death, I suppose that might have made him think.
Eric was more or less completely self-educated. His father, who was a very determined person, who actually didn't want to be a small businessman and wanted to become a musician, actually taught himself this very difficult instrument, the xylophone, and the bells, which is even more difficult, and from nowhere became successful enough to appear on the music hall in the war.
That was his persona in the music hall, Sid Besson, because there was a company called Besson who made xylophones, and so he nicked that name because there was another Sam Gordon in the same music halls he was playing, and you can see he's playing with 1, 2, 3, 4 sticks. He was obviously an extremely talented musician because he was self-taught, and throughout most of his life he had very, very poor eyesight because he was highly myopic, so he lost both retinas. I think one retina detached and the other one he couldn't see very well out of it. And so he was doing a lot of this with dreadful eyesight on board. And he ended up working in a factory as the person who puts the waterproofing on Macintoshes. A schmearer, they used to call them. Yeah.
Eric, at the age of about 13, because of his bar mitzvah, discovered that his aptitude for Hebrew, not for any other languages mind you, but for Hebrew, and it was suggested to his mother that he goes to the yeshiva. So off he went to Gateshead because he was living in Manchester.
The Tyne, the Coley Tyne, the queen of all the rivers, oh. Gateshead was once described by some well-known person as the dirty hole leading to Newcastle. Both Eric and Geoffrey restored Gateshead for me, my hometown as it were.
And he discovered an aptitude not for Hebrew, but actually for some of the more ethical, philosophical issues that were raised in the Shiva to do with the Torah and Jewish religion.
He had such precious memories of his mother and her acts of kindness, and because for a long time he was very dismissive of his father. Both Jeff and Eric resented him for a long time because they felt he neglected the family, and because of that they were running from city to city, jumping ship when they couldn't pay the rent and that sort of thing. He was christened Ephraim Gordon, but the Ephraim became kind of subsumed by Eric from about the age of 18 onwards. So that lovely one of him in the rabbinical college back in Gateshead, I think he was probably there about 2 years.
He was at a yeshiva on a Friday night, and he suddenly felt he just couldn't accept the Jewish religion as such, and just got up, walked out and went back to Manchester. On his return to his home in Manchester, where his elder brother was working and living, he was sort of confronted by his brother's communist beliefs. Now, his elder brother, whom he adored and who would protect him throughout his childhood in Manchester area, had met some German communist Jews who were refugees working factories in Manchester and become a communist. And he had then persuaded Eric to read Thomas Paine, Age of Reason, other books, and argued vociferously against God and for reason. He was based in the Royal Medical Corps in Colchester, wherever. I think it was Colchester, yeah, or somewhere like that. Aldershot.
Maybe he was dealing with wounded people from...
Yes, yeah, exactly. He was dealing with wounded peoples and dead bodies coming back. So yeah, he was a note taker for the pathologist, so probably a pretty gruesome job. So Eric became a journalist almost after getting demobbed from the army, and he worked on, I think the first paper was the Metal Bulletin, I think, and then he worked on a range of local papers around southern England, ended up on the Daily Herald. I think he probably felt that journalism was the tool that he had in his hand to try and hold power accountable.
Something that was always with him, a sort of really shabby plastic supermarket bag in which he had his mobile library.
What he used to say, I always remember this instruction, when you're speaking to people, ask lawyers questions.
That was his technique, the sort of soft questions, and finally there'd be the sort of razor-sharp analysis at the end of it. He was a bit like Columbo meets Socrates.
Brancusi said about Picasso that he had bullets for eyes. And I thought about that when I met Eric. He reminded me of that. Not only was he seeing everything, but actually he was thinking things through several steps ahead of what I was doing all the time.
He did have a sort of rabbinical, fatherly, kindly approach, at least to me at least, although he did also have a sardonic side. He could be quite scathing if he thought that you were talking about something that you really didn't know much about. Because he'd always check his facts. If you told him something, he'd always double check. He'd ask you more questions to verify what you just said. Because obviously when he was building a story, he would be careful to make sure that he wasn't going to write anything that couldn't be authenticated.
Well, he was absolutely terrifying to work for. He would take a piece and just rip it to pieces. You thought you'd done good work, and in fact, he would just take it apart.
Because if you didn't like a story and it was 2 hours to press time, you'd have to redo it, you know, even if it meant delaying publication. That's how he was.
Working for the Journal is a bit like committing a murder, and you can leave, you're allowed out on licence, but you can be called back at any time.
For Donald Cook, it was 0 hour. No use his sympathisers crying no evictions. The communist ex-paratrooper could effectively barricade his flat no longer. Evicted he was. So too, from his Silverdale House flat was the other rent rebel, communist Arthur Rowe. Any hope that the evictions would proceed peacefully was dashed from the start.
I was phoned at home, woken up, and told to get down to Leighton Road, which is, of course, where I went. When I didn't know Don at the time, Don Cook, Arthur Rowe, they were just two people who were leading this peculiar thing called a rent strike, and I was sent down to report it, and I did so, obviously, sympathetically, because, of course, I agreed with it. The sound of the crowd, you know, the sheer shouting, and drew me up. Leighton Road, I was, you know, magnetised and drawn by it, and where, of course, I saw this huge crowd of what must have been 2 or 3 or more thousand people. Then things would have got more rebellious, I should imagine, in Leighton Road, and what had been a comparatively, broadly speaking, calm morning, people in their thousands arguing with the police and so on, became much more one of, I think, fisticuffs in Leighton Road.
As true a story I'll relate. Hey-ho, cook and row. How the landlord told on cook one night. Hey-ho, cook and row. Oh, you must answer questions 9. Hey-ho, cook and row. To see if your flat is yours or mine. Hey-ho, cook and row. Hey-ho, tell them no, with a barbed wire fence and a piano. Took 1,000 cops to make them go. 3 cheers for cook and row. Oh, what is higher than a tree?
Hey-ho, cook and row.
And what is lower than a flea? Hey-ho, cook and row.
My rent is higher than a tree.
Hey-ho, cook and row.
And the landlord's lower than a flea.
Hey-ho, cook and row. Hey-ho, tell them no, with a barbed wire fence and a piano. Took 1,000 cops to make them go. 3 cheers for cook and row. Oh, what goes on and never stops.
So afterwards, the tenants and their supporters and people as a whole were being called upon to picket and go down to the Camden Town Hall. So of course then down into Euston Road poured this mass of people. Suddenly this woman came up to me, a middle-aged woman, and attacked me really viciously almost, and accused me of being a mercenary of the capitalist press. You know, she would have stood there arms akimbo, yelling at me. Of course, I knew her to be later Ellen Luby, whom I've long admired, and I stood there, and I didn't argue back, either cowardice or playing the game one plays as a journalist, that somehow you are detached, when in fact no one can ever be detached by events. You're part of them whether you like it or not. Anyway, I didn't argue with her, but accusing me of being a mercenary when I was a communist stayed with me. So all these years, I mean, 60 years later, I can still see her face and her yelling at me and this accusation. And it did make me think, was I a mercenary? I used to examine myself in the coming years, in the 60s, and I did ask myself, I never thought of myself as a mercenary, and I began to say, well, wait a minute, what am I objectively, what am I doing? And I did ask questions, and maybe it led eventually to my ideas which clashed with those of the Communist Party, which I then by accident left in the mid-60s. And I've often, and it's a long story, which I won't go into. It boils down, if I can bore people, with something that the Arthur Koestler, this very, in many ways, great writer, accused the Soviet interrogators of, because they would persuade communists that what they did amounted to whatever they were accused of. So of course you weren't a spy, but what you did amounted to being a spy. And so I must have asked that question of myself. Did what I was doing, did that amount to my being a mercenary in real terms? And so that's why you could say, if I was in a chair with a psychoanalyst now, you could say that partly persuaded me to help to found the Camden New Journal.
Yeah, unlike the majority of Communist Party members, he was attracted to the Chinese arguments in the Sino-Soviet split in the 60s.
I think he was actually enamoured more than anything of the peasant-based Chinese Communist Party model, rather than the over-centralist Soviet model, which is what was the opposite of the time.
He was disappointed with the progress of the Soviet Union, and he thought there was a lot of promise in Mao's revolution. But, you know, eventually was to be disappointed by that as well. But revolutions take a long time, as he said. So it's not the end of the story.
He began to be disillusioned with the Soviet model in the 50s, really, almost as soon as he left the army and started going on holidays in Eastern Europe. And then, of course, the Chinese came along with a much more rounded critique of the Soviet model. And so he just thought that the Chinese Revolution and Communist Party in China was purer, more loyal to Marxism, and less tainted by their dealings with the West. When we arrived in China in 1965, it was only 10 years after the Korean War. So, you know, the Chinese lost millions of soldiers in that war. Because, of course, at the time, the Americans were fighting the war in Vietnam. So they literally, and the Chinese were arming the Vietnamese, obviously, along with Russians. So they literally were the enemies. The other great Satan was, of course, the Kuomintang, the KMT, who were ensconced and fled to Taiwan. At the time, you know, I remember hearing it myself. You know, the trains were going, you know, from Russia to Vietnam, packed with Russian tanks. The Chinese were obviously transporting them, even though they were becoming mortal enemies to the Russians. They still transport, you know, and you know, it's a very much a live war. You know, the Chinese and the Russians were arming the Vietnamese, and they were fighting on the southern border. Mao and the few people around him were revolutionaries, and revolutionaries are people who need to live in constant change and whose whole psychological makeup is the overturning of existing elites and regimes and bureaucracies. He realized that with, you know, sufficient adoration and sufficient loyalty, he could launch forth you know, groups of people, the dissatisfied and the young, against the managing structures, and that's what he did. It was very peculiar. You know, I spent most of my time either running around with friends in this vast hostel complex, Soviet-built complex, or around the university college where our school was placed, which was opposite, and you know, there was no discipline, no school, the schools were closed, so we were little Red Guards, and we were going around in our Red Guard units, physically attacking the other Red Guard units, and you know, there were meetings and so on, and violence and injuries and death, so it was a pretty peculiar time. We would have criticism and attack meetings against our teachers. Everyone was told to rebel. In fact, his slogan was, "Bombard the headquarters." So Mao's slogan was, "Bombard the headquarters," which is, you know, you must overtake and attack the headquarters, i.e. the managers of you know, wherever you are. So all the school students attack the teachers, all the university students attack their teachers, and all the workers attack their bosses, and all the clerks and the office people attack their managers, and so on. For my parents, Eric at the office again took part in the meetings and the meetings in the office, where he and his colleagues were present when his former bosses were being condemned physically and, you know, verbally.
In the course of this revolution, the struggle is still going on between the revolutionary proletarian line, represented by Chairman Mao, and the bourgeois line of opposing revolution. Those who cling to the erroneous line are only a small handful of persons who divorce themselves from the people, oppose the people, and oppose Mao Zedong's thought. And this spells their certain failure.
In November 1967, we should have turned up in Hong Kong to head back to England, and didn't. And that was it. No more information at all. For 2 years we were locked in this room, in this hotel room, not far from Tiananmen Square actually, not far from Peking railway station, and I was the only one who was allowed out, effectively. I was allowed out once a week for an hour, and my mother was actually not allowed out at all. My father was allowed out because he went into the room opposite for interrogations occasionally. So most of the time it was incredibly boring, and we had to, amuse ourselves. They had to entertain me.
And he and his wife and their son just inventing things to do to get through the day, making toys from bits of cardboard of the packages that their food came in.
He was quite cruelly treated, he and his family. They were under arrest for 2 years. His son was only allowed out once a week. So, it was very harsh. So that was, for someone who supported the revolution, that was quite a revelation.
They say to you, you know what you've done. Tell us what you've done. Now he did a really stupid thing, and the main stupid thing he did was he wrote notes for a book he was going to write, actually in support of Mao and the Cultural Revolution, but in a sort of English journalistic way, obviously a warts and all type thing. So he told people he was going to write this book. He told people he was writing notes. Then he hid the notes because he was, last minute, I think he felt that the security police would never allow him to take the notes out. So he decided to hide the notes behind a picture of Chairman Mao, which is massive insult, And obviously the Chinese security police went through our luggage on a fine-tooth comb, looking for the notes, presumably. And eventually they found it. So that was a sort of prima facie case. You have notes. And why do you have notes? And he says, because I was going to write a book about China and the Cultural Revolution. And they said, well, it will be anti-Chinese. It will be anti-Mao. He said, no, it won't. And they said, yes, it will. And therefore, you are an agent of the imperialists. You may not know you're an agent of the imperialists. You may not consciously be an agent, but effectively you'd be an agent of the imperialists because you'd be writing an article writing a book critical of Chairman Mao and the Communist Party and Cultural Revolution. And that went on for 2 years, in which they went back and forwards over how you could be an unconscious agent of the imperialists by writing a book.
There's this constant pressure of wanting to get away somehow, and they finally coming to the conclusion that the only way to get away from this place is to dream up a false confession in some sort of Marxist-Leninist theoretical lingo that would convince these people that he was on the level, that he wouldn't be betraying them. And after several attempts and several failed confessions, which were very, very long written documents, he finally came up with one that did work. And he's published all of these confessions in the second half of the book, which, as you may be able to imagine, they're pretty difficult to wade through because it's all this kind of sort of half-baked political theory that he didn't really himself believe in.
One effect that the experience in China under house arrest might have had on my father would have made him possibly more determined to confront, untrammeled power, whether it's corporate or, bureaucratic, or just people who have power over other people and make decisions about other people, and there's no recourse to any other outside justice or whatever.
But I think he understood that in the kind of society China was at the time, that freedom would have been a luxury. So he's prepared to sort of forgive them for what they'd done to him.
The strike was over the closure of Camden Journal by a company called Courier Press, and so it involved 9 staff of the journal, including myself, but it also involved other newspapers owned by Courier Press. So it was quite extensive, and it went on for about 16 months.
Eric was the editor, yeah. Howard was leading basically the instrumental force in uniting newsrooms, NUJ members all around the country, to come and fight for us. And so there were strikes, Newcastle, Manchester, Coventry, you name it.
Yeah, there was picketing all over Warwickshire, really, because that's where most of the papers, Courier Press's papers, were. So yeah, it was a busy campaign. We were on the road quite a lot. Out of that dispute, another campaign emerged called the Save the Journal campaign, and the council gave us offices or premises in the building where the journal is at the moment, and this campaign brought in a lot of local community, like Terry Hargraves, he's a tenants activist, John Mason from Hillview, Alf Barrett, another tenants activist. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for a new paper.
We knew that we wanted to do something and form our own paper, but we never imagined that the Camden Journal would sell the title for a peppercorn price, which was £1.
Courier Press obviously thought it was worthless. So, you want to save the paper, here it is, good riddance. So Eric thought this was an offer that couldn't be refused. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to run a paper his way without greedy bosses. Myself and an old colleague of his called Frank Branscombe joined him as founder members. And Frank's involvement was quite crucial because Frank was also ran a paper in Bedford called the Bedfordshire on Sunday, which was a giveaway and quite successful. So it was under his influence that the Camden New Journal became a free paper. He was told, early on by lots of people that that paper would be a failure, because after all, he only had the title. But he thought he was always in with a fighting chance.
It was about commitment to a set of principles and a set of beliefs. So you're not expected to want much money or to expect much money.
It has the kind of profit margins that other companies wouldn't accept. They'd be sacking staff or closing the title down. The paper was distributed, and in the early weeks, staff actually went round distributing the paper themselves, to plug in any of the gaps left out by the company we hired. We all took pay cuts, so we weren't being paid the proper rate, and that went on for about 3 years. But we were all sustained by this sense of adventure. You know, it was fun and it was exciting, and we knew we were involved in something special.
I think the attitude was the papers, we are the good guys, and I am the head of the good guys. Therefore, you know, we do what we have to do. But we do it for good reasons, and we do it to keep the paper going.
There was a lot of support, as I said, from the community. The journal offices were like a community centre, actually, in the beginning. People just be coming in to pass news on to you, or to pass a time of day with you.
We used to have various personalities simply just come in to the office and sit there for ages, talking and giving us stories and basically getting angry. I mean, I remember people like Ellen Luby, John Retty, Terry Hargrave.
And there was an outpouring of people from all around the community in Camden supporting us. It was overwhelming, actually, and you know, from the councils, the MPs, from local organisations, they were just backing, because had we gone, there was only the Ham and High left.
By making the paper free from the outset, that was a business strategy, because you create an instantly high circulation figure to attract advertising, as opposed to trying to build it up over several years. Because, you know, newspapers just eat up your money. The journal was started off with a £56,000 loan, and it would have only lasted us a year. So we needed that high circulation figure. So we did get quite good advertising early on. The other thing is, all advertisers want is to know that the paper they're buying space in is widely read and popular, and that was obviously the case.
The letters page was, in a sense, the most important page, the page where the public put their views of what was happening.
There's pages of letters now, and people have a place to write to, you know, that they're at home, working from home, whatever things, they can't go this place, can't that, but they can write to the journal and put that's been really extended for people to write in.
You know, he was very proud but also very modest, because one thing about Eric was that he was never satisfied. You're only as good as your last campaign, so once one was finished you have to start on a new one. The Whittington Hospital, definitely. That was to prevent the closure of the A&E unit.
He gave Tom Foote the time, the space and the backing to dig and dig and dig into the whole issue about the closure of the A&E.
When they wanted to close the Whittington, he got the battle bus together, got on the bus, you know, and made a kind of a major thing out of it. And in the end they climbed down. And that's the essence of the man. He went into battle and he did not stop until he won.
I mean, there were so many campaigns against the closure of fire stations. One of the more recent ones was the Save the Kentish Town City Farm.
In 2015, the New Journal really took up the cudgels on behalf of school meal operatives, workers who used to be referred to as dinner ladies, whose jobs had been privatised by the council in a cost-cutting drive. And as a result, the new employer had essentially suppressed wages. And despite the fact that Camden was trumpeting its position as a London living wage employer, this council contractor was paying substantially below the then London living wage.
Well, I often say that if Grenfell Tower had been in Camden, there wouldn't have been a disaster, because at the time of the fire there was no newspaper covering Kensington and Chelsea, and I don't think there is at the moment. So when the tenants had their grievances, it never went beyond the tenants' newsletter. If the tower had been in Camden, then CNJ reporters would have picked the story up. brought pressure to bear on the council, and you know, something would have been done.
But it stopped them selling off the housing, or outsourcing the housing, I suppose you should say. It stopped them doing that.
There's an extraordinary situation where the government refused to provide the hundreds of millions of pounds needed to do up the council's stock, unless the council agreed to transfer all its properties to an ALMO, an arm's length management organisation. And the council very reluctantly campaigned for this, but the tenants voted against it.
It's exposed lots of goings on. It's been there for people. One great role of the journal is to be there for people who are having problems, who normally wouldn't have anywhere to have a voice. Eric was a great lover of the arts, music and painting and writing, of course, literature. And he promoted that heavily. And his column, the John Gulliver column, it's been running from before the New Journal, running the old journal. That covered artistic stuff every week. The Communist Party, all these parties were, if working class people went into them, they suddenly were in touch with middle class people, educated people, and that rubbed off on them. I think that happened across the board. For a lot of working people, the trade unions were the place where they got to sort of get an education, a higher education. And he got his higher education, I think, in the Communist Party.
Eric would identify exhibitions that perhaps not many people knew about in the Camden area. When the Freud Museum had an exhibition, he'd highlight it. Ben-Uri, of course, Camden Art Centre, very important, offering very important exhibitions. So to highlight and draw attention to local people about what's happening in their own area is actually really important, because in an age of huge communication, actually it becomes increasingly more difficult to communicate. And so the Camden New Journal filled, for me certainly, and my cohort, it fills the gap between reality, actuality and opinion.
Really, all the community projects that we've been running throughout Hampstead, the Camden New Journal has always reported them, and Eric has been central to that.
The Camden New Journal critic came very often here and see the work we did, which was reflecting what will happen in Cyprus, and also classics. We did a lot of classics. Antigone, King Oedipus at Kolonos, and Aristophanes, the Knight's Peace. Eric himself used to come to see and encourage the young critics to write favorably about our work.
Yeah, Eric used to always send me to John's shows. And I remember John did a particularly chaotic show at the New End Theatre. And halfway through the show, looked up and saw me there. And he said, and I'd like to thank the Camden New Journal for sending a reporter, the only paper that's done so this evening. It's a left-wing paper, for God's sake. so yeah, it was, those are halcyon days. But yes, that sense of the paper being part of the community and the community part of the paper.
Because obviously you've got, you know, the literati, the Guardian-esque sort of in NW3, that sort of, you know, of where there's quite a bit of Judaism in there as well. And then you've got, you know, the Regent's Park estate. And I guess it's not unique to Camden in terms of demographics. I mean, I live in Ladbroke Grove, Camden and Chelsea. It's a similar, but I think the journal probably appeared at the right time, and it's managed to marry those two quite disparate communities.
I mean, the paper is well respected, both on the council estates and in the sort of upmarket streets of Hampstead and Primrose Hill and Belsize Park.
It does have a radical reputation, alongside a reputation of being a home of the rich, indeed the idle rich. They've got a very big sort of stake in the area. This is a walk that I do called No Gods, No Masters, Radical Secularists, Suffragists and Pacifists. but I'm doing this one specially because to honour the Camden New Journal's 40th anniversary, and the Camden New Journal, a great independent newspaper that was founded and edited for so many years, decades, by Eric Gordon.
Eric was exceptional. The Journal is exceptional. There's no doubt about that. You compare the Journal to any local paper all over Britain, and the Journal stands out. There's nothing to match it. It's got a huge footprint within the borough. We've also got the Tribune, which is going the same way, the Islington Tribune, which is now following the Journal's footsteps. Started in 2004. That's now making a huge impact in Islington, becoming sort of a crucial part of Islington life as the Journal is in Camden.
I think Camden Council listens to Camden New Journal, respects Camden New Journal. They think that it's a very important and is popular, and the working class, the ordinary people read it. It's free, and have very interesting stories and access to a lot of information and help.
There isn't a week in my life that I do not read the Camden New Journal, and that goes for our cohort, and we have a cohort at Hampstead School of Art of over 6,000. And we often talk about what's in the CNJ this week because it's very important to us, and it not only keeps us informed, but I think gives us correct information. It gives you information that you can rely on.
Obviously the local press now is essentially controlled by one company across London, and whilst I think actually the New Journal's probably contributed to a resurgence in standards, it's in the context of woefully underfunded investigative journalism, whereas the CNJ was always prepared under Eric's leadership to follow leads and to devote resource to investigation and campaigning.
I like to think we do it quite well. We've got drivers, we've got 4 drivers, we've got 30-odd staff to do door-to-door, we've got checkers.
Organisations where the founder then dies, the question is whether the culture that they've helped foster in that organisation survives. And that's a question of how deep-rooted it is, and in what sense of the people that work there now have imbibed that culture and will continue it, against all the slings and arrows that they're going to face going forward, and whether they can then, imbue that culture into the next generation. I mean, that's the question, and I don't know.
Eric was very careful with the politics of the paper. And the paper is fundamentally to the left and on the side of the people of Camden and against the establishment of all kinds, from the medical establishment to the political establishment to the council to businesses. It's there for the ordinary person. But I was always careful to keep the editorial page quite balanced. So you didn't get this sort of feeling it was a left-wing communist newspaper, which it wasn't. It was quite balanced in the way he edited it.
He was a good socialist operating in a capitalist world, which isn't necessarily easy. Being a socialist journalist in a capitalist world is becoming more and more difficult. Being a socialist businessman in a capitalist world requires a lot of tightrope walking, and it's quite dangerous stuff. And Eric accomplished that.
But in doing so, he built up a sustainable business model. So sustainable that he was able to open up 2 other newspapers, the Islington Tribune and the Westminster Extra. So that is an enormous legacy, because whilst other newspapers are being shut down, he opened not just 1 but 3.
Well, I came to realise at the end he was a bit of a genius, and we all thought he was a terrible businessman, but in fact history has proved he's a bloody good businessman, exceptionally good businessman.
The thing that comes to mind is the old Karl Marx quote about how great philosophers are there to interpret the world, but the point is to change it. And that's what Eric set out to do, and he carried on. He kept that going until his dying day.
That's from I miss Eric from London, and also that memory of Gateshead, you know, and one is gone, but the people continue to go on, marching on, and you know, but there's people at the Journal, Dan Carrier, Tom Foote, etc., who are, you know, just anchors like Eric was.
He never pretended that he was anybody or he has created a newspaper. He was humble, he was very interested in helping. When he felt it was time to do something for somebody, he did it, you know, and he didn't needed any reward or any applause or any thank you.
We could spend as much time together as we wanted, and we never fell out. We never really got bored. Yeah, we had some lovely times, and he used to make me laugh.
Had enough yet? The next room along, isn't it? Oh, this big golden door.
Those people singing the gospel.
But yeah, I mean, we went all over the world: India, Nice, Paris. We spent a lot of time in Paris, and we just travelled so much together. He even came to where my parents came from, Trinidad. He used to go every year to the Durham Gala, and he took me a couple of years, and I was just a love the brass bands and all the music and the sort of festive spirit of it. He just loved music per se, and as you see, I play the piano, and so he used to also ask me to just play while he lay on this sofa and fell asleep. Yeah.
They came to hear me sing at London Folk Clubs from time to time, and then I sang at their wedding, an Irish song at their wedding. Yeah.
Bob and Eric had known each other for about 40 years, and I think the big thing they had in common was Bob originally came from Gateshead, and of course they shared that memory of Eric's time in Gateshead. And Bob sang at our wedding, and I had actually just in passing said to my husband, "Oh, I really like that song. She moved through the fair." I'd heard it in the film Michael Collins, and I said to him, "Oh, it's a lovely song." And lo and behold, Bob appeared singing this song. It was such a lovely thing, because I knew the origin of it, and that Eric had really thought, how can I please Sam on that special day?
I've got to think about that. Oh, my true love said to me, my mother won't mind, and my father won't slight you for your lack of kind. And she stepped away from me, and this she did say, it will not be long, lover, until our wedding day. She stepped away from me, and she moved through the fair, and fondly I watched her move here and move there. She smiled as she passed with her goods and her gear, and that was the last that I saw of my dear. And I dreamt it last night that my true love came in. So softly she moved, and her feet making no din. She laid her hand on mine, And this she did say, it will not be long, lover, until our wedding day. That's it.